Well, this one's certainly not going to leave you craving any more SSU movies. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the sixth film in the SSU, Sony's 2024 action superhero film, Kraven the Hunter. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content, like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. Kraven the Hunter stars Aaron Taylor Johnson, Ariana DeBose, and Fred Hechinger, and was directed by J.C. Chandor. It tells the origin story of the vigilante anti-hero, Kraven the Hunter, as he fights to protect his brother while exacting his brutal brand of justice. Well, we've got ourselves another SSU movie, so you know the deal. A C-list Spider-Man villain you may or may not have heard of, some extraordinarily cheesy 2000s vibes, and of course, no Spider-Man. I mean, why would he ever be in Sony's Spider-Man universe? That's just silly. This has been a peculiar franchise, to say the least. None of the movies are good by any objective metrics. The Venom films can be subjectively entertaining to the right audiences, thanks to the humor and entertaining tonal blend, but the rest of the films in this franchise? Not even close. So does the appearance of the mythical villainous hunter Kraven break that trend? Not a chance. It's always a fairly negative time talking about non-Venom SSU movies, so let's flip things around and start with the positive here, or at least as close to positive as we can get. Despite being among the biggest issues in nearly every other movie in this franchise, Kraven the Hunter's action sequences are surprisingly entertaining. Some of them are pretty decent, others are eye-rollingly bogged down by terrible CGI, but most manage to strike a weird balance between the two, blending endearingly clunky 2000s-era climbing and jumping physics with comic book movie silliness and fun. But this movie takes things a step further, with some surprisingly bloody and brutal moments. This is the first R-rated movie in the SSU, and although it doesn't take advantage of that from a story perspective, it definitely earns that rating during a handful of its more brutal action sequences. Kraven the Hunter is a character I knew absolutely nothing about, but this movie presents his origins and story in fairly typical anti-hero vigilante fashion. The origins of his powers here are very silly, and his vigilante brand of justice is something we've seen many times before, but I did appreciate the family dynamics at play here. They weren't very well written, but the brotherly aspects of the story kept me engaged, invested, and mostly having a decent time. That writing, though, whew, such a terrible screenplay. Almost as bad as Morbius and Madam Web, which is saying something. Kraven the Hunter is a touch more coherent than either of those two films, but this still manages to be an oddly structured and poorly paced part origin story, part rescue mission. The awful dialogue and lengthy exposition sequences result in some incredibly stilted line delivery from nearly every actor involved. And as has become a trend, there's an unnecessary overabundance of villains here, none of which contribute very much to this jumbled, frequently aimless story. I hate to sound like a broken record, but like all of the other non-Venom SSU movies, the technical elements of this film are especially rough. One of the big negative standouts here is the editing. Whether we're talking the structure of the film as a whole, or the bizarre overlaid editing during Kraven's superpower origin scene, it's just laughably bad. Again, somehow more coherent than Morbius or Madam Web, but still very weak by normal film standards. Reshoots are not uncommon for movies, but it's rare for reshoots to be so poorly inserted into the edit. The audience isn't supposed to be able to easily pick out what was reshot, but this movie may as well have had a reshoot watermark across the screen for those scenes. Speaking of post-production work, Kraven rivals Madam Web when it comes to the degree of spaghetti western levels of ADR. That's all pretty rough, but I know what you're thinking. You haven't even touched on the visual effects yet. It's an SSU movie, so you know exactly what to expect here. Like the other films in this disconnected franchise, Kraven the Hunter leans into that intentionally cheesy 2000s vibe, so the visual effects look like they were pulled right out of 2004. Some of it's actually kind of endearing. The weird movement physics, for example, give everything that refreshingly unserious comic book movie feel, but then we get to the CGI animals. There are a lot of animals in this movie, and somehow they seem to get progressively worse as the film continues. Honestly, this feels like a movie that was given up on by the studio. After years of delays and an entire franchise run of poor reviews and box office failures, this really seems like Sony just cutting their losses and throwing a barely done movie at us in order to finally wash their hands of the disaster that was the SSU. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The biggest pro is the action. To be perfectly honest, there's a lot of movies out there that have far, far better action than this one, but when we're focusing specifically on SSU movies, this one is better than expected. The R rating and brutality of some of the sequences definitely helps in this regard, but even in the more standardly PG-13 sequences, I found myself enjoying the action here much more than I have in almost any of the other SSU films, including the Venom movies. Some of these action scenes are better than others, and the film is plagued by some rough-looking CGI, but much of the action here takes on a nostalgically endearing quality. On the cons side, the biggest issue is the screenplay. Really, everything about the writing is awful here. The story itself is poorly constructed, the dialogue's terrible, there's way too much exposition. I really don't know why this has been such an issue for this franchise, but they haven't seemed to be able to piece together anything that's both interesting and coherent. Once again, we're presented with far too many villains in this story for no real reason, other than throwing characters that comic superfans might recognize. It's just disappointing, because I do think this character could have resulted in something interesting, especially with regard to his family dynamics. But instead, we're faced with yet another very mediocre SSU entry. The second con has got to be the visual effects. Given the quality of visual effects in all 5 of the other SSU movies, I'm sure this comes as no surprise to anyone. There are certain elements of this that are somewhat charming in a cheesy way, like the clunky movement physics of Kraven as he climbs walls and jumps around, but the actual full CGI creations in this movie are rough. Most of these are in the form of various animals that Kraven encounters over the course of the story. They're almost always bad, but seem to get progressively worse the further on in the film we go. So it's pretty evident that the priority shifted to just getting this film out, rather than trying to make it look good. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Kraven the Hunter, or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy in one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Kraven the Hunter 2.5 out of 5 paws. It's got some decent, albeit ridiculous, action sequences, but the awful screenplay and poor editing and visual effects make it hard to appreciate. It's about what you'd expect from a non-Venom SSU movie at this point. I would recommend Kraven the Hunter to SSU fans who want a bit more action. This takes a slightly more serious approach than Venom, and is a bit more coherent than Morbius and Madam Web, so it's okay if you're really craving a 2000s feeling action comic book movie. Existing Kraven the Hunter fans will probably be disappointed, though, by the toned-down quality and heroic antics of their favorite Spider-Man villain. If you liked Kraven the Hunter, I would recommend The Punisher. This is another Marvel vigilante anti-hero story that has some screenplay and character issues. It came out in 2004, so naturally has that 2000s vibe to it that all of the SSU films emulate, and focuses on a character who uses brutal and violent tactics to exact family-motivated revenge. If you don't really care about the comic book movie aspects, you might want to watch Beast, which is a solid When Animals Attack film featuring lions. With its anti-poaching undercurrents and surprisingly decent for the genre visual effects, this is a respectable and occasionally brutal natural horror thriller. And if you found yourself most drawn to the kidnapping subplot here, you should check out All the Money in the World. Based on a true story, this drama focuses on the kidnapping of John Paul Getty III, the unique relationship he forges with his kidnappers, and his billionaire grandfather's refusal to pay his ransom. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Kraven the Hunter? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite movie about a vigilante? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe if you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.